Hi everyone, my name is Serena Midha and I'm presenting this work on behalf of Max Wilson and Sarah Sharples. We researched the ethical concerns and perceptions of consumer neurotechnology from lived experiences of mental workload tracking. The motivation behind this is that because of developments in neuroscience and technology, we've never been closer to being able to monitor our cognitive activity in real-world environments. Consumer neurotechnology is starting to arrive, and currently available devices aim to, for example, help us improve our sleep or execute demands during gaming sessions. The benefits could be large of consumer neurotechnology, for example, for our health and our well-being, but there's also the potential for negative and unintended consequences. So the ethical side of consumer neurotechnology should remain in the forefront of our minds. Neuroethics is a field concerned with the ethical, legal and social issues emerging from progress in neuroscience. In terms of consumer neurotechnology, there are currently active and ongoing ethical and legal discussions happening, as well as the development of frameworks. These surround privacy, data validity and personal identity. And the way these frameworks are developed, it tends to be that gaps are identified in existing frameworks and they're developed to incorporate brain data. So there's a lack of empirical research in this area as it tends to be theoretical. So we aimed to investigate the ethical perceptions and concerns of actual potential end users of future neurotechnology. Current frameworks tend to refer to consumer neurotechnology in general, so several different types of neurotechnology. But because we ran a study with participants, we needed to focus upon a certain type of neurotechnology so that we could discuss it. And the neurotechnology we chose was mental workload. And there's no agreed upon definition of mental workload in the literature. But the components that it is comprised of are agreed to be the demands of a task and the experience of responding to a task, and both of those factors affect how well somebody is able to perform on a task. We chose mental workload for a few different reasons. Firstly, it's a concept very relevant to the field of neuroergonomics, where the aim is to improve performance at work, especially in safety critical situations, by preventing the states of overload and underload, which is where mistakes are likely to happen. It's a concept really relevant to broader work scenarios, for example, a lawyer submitting important paperwork at the office. And we think it's also a concept really relevant in our daily lives. With the world becoming more technological, we're frequently performing tasks at home that require different mental workload levels. Finally, there's a lot of research aiming to objectively measure mental workload in the real world, so it's conceivable that this will be a type of neurotechnology in the future. So while we're focusing on a certain type of neurotechnology in this study, which is mental workload trackers, we're confident that the results will be generalisable beyond this. The method, we had 19 participants. All participants provided informed and written consent, and all participants were office workers as well. Before this interview study, participants had taken part in a study the week before where they tracked their own mental workload levels in their lives from the Monday to the Friday subjectively. And that was because by the time they came for an interview with us, we wanted to have participants that had had the chance to consider mental workload in their lives and what it meant to them before we probed them in depth about their experiences and perceptions. So the interviews lasted between 1 to 2 hours, and large parts of those interviews involved asking participants about their perceptions and concerns about the ethical side of the introduction and development of consumer neurotechnology. IPA was performed on the data, which is a qualitative method, and 3 themes emerged. Theme 1 was fear of the data, Theme 2 was the negative effect of the data on the self, and Theme 3 was the spectrum of sharing. And I'll go through each of these in turn. So theme 1 had 3 sub-themes. Sub-theme 1 was fear of personal judgment, and this related to participants' concerns about people viewing their data and making assumptions about them as individuals. This could be in a work context or in a personal context, from family or friends. One participant outlined how they game in the evenings and they would hate questions being asked by their family about their mental workload levels in the evenings. Subtheme 2 was fear of consequences, and this related to concerns about the negative effects that might occur as a result of somebody viewing the cognitive activity data. This could be in a work environment, for example, being denied a raise at work based on the data, or even during the hiring process where you might not get hired for a job based on the data. This sub-theme also related to data exploitation, for example, from insurance companies. Sub-theme 3 was fear of inaccurate judgment, and this related to data misinterpretation and data validity. In terms of data misinterpretation, participants outlined how the context of the data was very important for understanding, and if somebody was viewing their data without having the context explained, this could be open to misinterpretation. Participants also outlined how cognitive activity data is complex to understand, and this in itself might lead to misinterpretations of the data by whoever's viewing it. Data validity related to the concern about the technology itself not providing valid data, and participants were concerned that if the technology wasn't providing valid data, they might be basing some decisions based on inaccurate data. Theme 2 was the negative effect of the data on the self, and there was 2 sub-themes. Sub-theme 1 was being controlled by the data, and this related to participants' concerns about people becoming obsessive about their data, as we sometimes see with physical activity tracking. For example, somebody becoming obsessive about how many steps they've walked each day. Sub-theme 2 was data exacerbating negative states, and it was outlined how for people who have problems with their mental health, this could basically provide them with a rod to beat themselves with. For example, if somebody hasn't met their goals for the day, this could increase their negative self-talk further. This is a quote about becoming obsessive with the data. One concern is if you become too obsessed with it and it becomes a fixation and you can't stop looking and tracking. I know people who have done that with heart rate monitors. They're like, what's my heart rate now? Oh my gosh, it's 72, 62. So you can get obsessed with it. Theme 3 was the spectrum of sharing, and this related to participants' thoughts about sharing their data with others. Sub-theme 1 was what concerns, and a few participants had no concerns when it came to privacy about sharing their data. They didn't really mind who saw it, and there was no problem with that. Sub-theme 2 was controlled sharing for positive change, and some participants were willing to share their data with their workplaces if they were in control of it, and they would do this for personal improvements or company improvements. For example, being given more responsibility or having to work less hours. Sub-theme 3 was it depends on the risk, and generally participants thought that enforcing mandatory tracking on safety critical workers was more reasonable than other types of worker, and it was perhaps similar to other types of intrusive tests that safety critical workers are already often subjected to, such as drugs tests, but it was important to participants that the data was not used on a personal level but instead used to make company improvements or changes to company policy. Sub-theme 4 was an absolute no, and a few participants weren't willing to share their data with anybody. The data should remain private just to themselves. This is a quote about safety critical worker tracking. I think if you're a pilot, then maybe yes, mandatory tracking is acceptable just because you have lives in your hands. It's not like you didn't submit an Excel spreadsheet that you were asked for. So instead of reviewing existing frameworks, we conducted an empirical study. Our findings related to concerns surrounding the privacy of data, data validity, and personal identity. And these concerns have already been identified in previous literature. So the findings from our study have further validated previous findings. The findings relating to safety critical jobs, where participants thought it was more reasonable to enforce mandatory tracking on safety critical workers compared to other types of worker, and concerns relating to data misinterpretation, where participants were concerned the data might not be understood properly, appear to be novel findings in the context of consumer neurotechnology, and it can open further considerations for the development of consumer neurotechnology. So the current status of concerns, there is a lack of regulation, as consumer neurotechnology is still at a discussion stage instead of a regulation stage. In terms of privacy, GDPR is legally binding, but it has gaps that leave brain data open to privacy breaches. In terms of data validity, well, consumer neurotechnology companies avoid classifying their products as medical, as this would be subject to stricter regulations. Instead, companies tend to classify their products as for well-being, in the well-being space, as this would avoid the regulations. Personal identity is more of a grey area, but these concerns could be guided by approaches taken to physical activity trackers, as there are similar concerns in that field and it's more established and embedded into our lives. It's the same for data misinterpretation, as that's a novel finding as well. And a good starting point is to look at approaches to physical activity tracking, as it's discussed in that literature. For safety critical jobs, I think we've opened a discussion about the privacy regulations for personal use versus work use and the different types of work as well. Thank you for listening, and questions are welcome.